They told me it was just another night shift, a simple job on a quiet oil rig. They didn't mention the unsettling regulations, the unexplained occurrences, or the pervasive feeling that I wasn't alone in this isolated Texas desert. There's a secret lurking in the shadows of this rig, and I'm about to uncover it. Are you brave enough to come along? The drive to Blackstone oil rig took 3 hours through nothing but endless stretches of barren Texas wasteland. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been working oil rig for the better part of a decade, but nothing quite prepared me for the sight that greeted me as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The rig rose from the desert floor like a mechanical skeleton, its steel bones casting long, twisted shadows across the cracked earth. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of machinery that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. As I pulled my truck up to the makeshift parking area, really just a patch of hard-pan dirt marked by oil stains and tire tracks, I noticed something immediately unsettling. There were only 3 other vehicles parked there, all of them older models covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested they hadn't moved in weeks, maybe months. For a facility that supposedly operated around the clock, the lack of personnel was immediately apparent and deeply troubling. The security gate stood wide open, its chain-link fence stretching into the distance before disappearing into the gathering dusk. No guard, no checkpoint, no sign-in procedure. Just an empty booth with darkened windows and a clipboard hanging by a rusted chain, its pages yellowed and curling in the dry heat. I grabbed my gear bag and approached the main structure, my boots crunching on gravel that seemed to echo far too loudly in the oppressive quiet. The foreman who greeted me at the entrance was a weathered man named Bill Hendricks, probably in his 60s, with skin like leather and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. His handshake was firm but brief, and he wasted no time on pleasantries. "You're the new night shift," he said, more statement than question. "Hope you're not the type who needs much conversation, because you won't be getting it out here." Bill led me through the facility with mechanical efficiency, his explanations delivered in a monotone that suggested he'd given this tour countless times before. The equipment was indeed archaic. Massive pumps and generators that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than an active operation. Pipes ran overhead in complex patterns that seemed to follow no logical design, creating a maze of shadows and blind spots that made me instinctively uncomfortable. "Day shift leaves at 6, Bill explained as we walked. "Night shift runs skeleton crew, just you and 2 others. Tommy handles the pumps, Elena monitors the pressure gauges, and you'll be doing general maintenance and security rounds." He stopped abruptly and turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "There are some rules you need to understand. Not company policy, mind you, but things that'll keep you safe and sane out here." The way he emphasized rules made my skin crawl, but I nodded and waited for him to continue. "First rule, never go down to the drilling platform alone after midnight. I don't care what alarms are going off or what readings you're getting. You wait for backup or you wait until morning." He paused, studying my face for any sign of resistance. "Second rule, if you hear knocking from inside the equipment housing units, you ignore it. Document the time and location, but don't investigate. Third rule, and this is important, if you see lights moving around the perimeter that don't belong to vehicles, you radio the others immediately, but don't approach." I wanted to ask why, wanted some explanation for these bizarre protocols, but something in Bill's demeanor warned me against pushing too hard on my first day. Instead, I simply nodded and asked, "How many people have worked night shift here recently?" Bill's pause was long enough to be uncomfortable. "You're the 4th this year," he finally said. "The others found work elsewhere. Better opportunities, you know how it is." But the way he said it suggested that elsewhere might not have been entirely voluntary. As we completed the tour, I met my 2 fellow night shift workers. Tommy Valdez was a compact man in his 40s with nervous energy and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He acknowledged my introduction with a grunt and immediately returned his attention to a gauge that seemed to be reading normal levels. Elena Kowalski appeared to be in her 30s, with sharp features and an intensity that made me feel like she was constantly evaluating me for some purpose I couldn't understand. When I tried to make small talk, she simply stared at me for several seconds before turning back to her console. "They're good people," Bill said as he prepared to leave for the day's shift. "They've been here longer than most. Listen to what they tell you." Again, that emphasis that suggested deeper meaning. As the sun finally disappeared completely behind the distant hills, the rig transformed. What had been merely unsettling in daylight became genuinely eerie in the darkness. The overhead lights created pools of harsh illumination separated by deep shadows, and the mechanical sounds that had been barely noticeable during the day now seemed amplified and somehow more urgent. The wind, which had been still during the afternoon, picked up and began to whistle through the steel framework with a sound that was almost musical, almost like voices calling from a great distance. My first official duty was to complete a perimeter check, a simple walk around the facility to ensure all gates were secure and all equipment was functioning normally. Tommy handed me a clipboard with a pre-printed checklist and a heavy-duty flashlight that felt reassuringly solid in my hand. "Stick to the marked paths," he said, not looking up from his gauges. "And Jake," he finally met my eyes. "If something feels wrong, trust that feeling." As I stepped out into the Texas night, the desert silence was overwhelming. The stars were brilliant in the unpolluted sky, but their light seemed cold and distant. I began my circuit, checking off items on the list, and trying to shake the growing certainty that I was being watched from somewhere in the surrounding darkness. About halfway through the route, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, clearly visible in the beam of my flashlight, were footprints in the dusty ground beside one of the equipment sheds. They were recent. I could tell because they hadn't been disturbed by the wind that had picked up after sunset. But what made them unsettling wasn't their freshness. It was their pattern. The prints approached the shed from the direction of the desert, circled it 3 times, then stopped abruptly at the locked door. There were no returning tracks. I stood there for several minutes, playing the flashlight beam around the area and trying to find some logical explanation. A security guard making rounds? But Bill had said nothing about additional security, and the prints were smaller than mine, made by someone wearing different boots than any I'd seen on the crew. An intruder? But who would break into an oil rig just to walk in circles? As I continued my rounds, I found 2 more sets of similar prints near different buildings, all following the same inexplicable pattern. Circle 3 times, stop at the door, vanish. By the time I returned to the main building, I was thoroughly unnerved and eager to discuss what I'd found with Tommy and Elena. But when I described the footprints, their reactions were even more disturbing than the discovery itself. Tommy's hands finally stopped their constant movement, and Elena looked up from her monitors for the first time since I'd returned. They exchanged a glance that clearly communicated something I wasn't privy to. "Did you document the locations?" Elena asked. "Yes, but..." "Good. That's all you need to do." She turned back to her screens, effectively ending the conversation. Tommy was slightly more forthcoming. "Look, Jake, there are things about this place that don't make sense. The sooner you accept that and just focus on following procedures, the easier your time here will be." He hesitated, then added quietly, "The previous night shift supervisor spent too much time trying to solve mysteries. Last anyone saw him, he was heading out to investigate some lights near the drilling platform." "What happened to him?" "Company said he quit without notice. Didn't even collect his final paycheck." Tommy's expression suggested he found this explanation as unsatisfying as I did. As my first night progressed, I began to understand why the previous supervisors hadn't lasted long. Every routine task felt charged with potential danger. Every shadow seemed to hide something watching and waiting. The mechanical sounds of the rig created a constant audio backdrop that occasionally resolved into patterns that sounded almost like conversation, like whispered words in a language I couldn't quite understand. Around 3 in the morning, during what should have been the quietest part of the night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From somewhere deep within the facility came a sound like metal striking metal in a rhythmic pattern. 3 short strikes, pause. 3 short strikes, pause. It repeated for almost 5 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. I looked at Tommy and Elena, expecting some reaction, some acknowledgement of what we'd all clearly heard. But they continued their work as if nothing had happened, their studied indifference more frightening than the mysterious sound itself. When my shift ended at 6 a.m. and the day crew began to arrive, I felt a relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. But as I drove away from Blackstone oil rig, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just another dark spot on the horizon, I knew that I would be back. Not because I wanted to return, but because something about that place had gotten under my skin. Questions had been planted in my mind that demanded answers, even if pursuing those answers might lead me down the same path as my predecessor. The drive home should have been relaxing, a chance to decompress and process the strange events of the night. Instead, I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see lights following me through the desert darkness. And when I finally reached my apartment and tried to sleep, my dreams were filled with the sound of footsteps circling in the dust and metal striking metal in that haunting, deliberate rhythm. Something was waiting for me at Blackstone oil rig, something that had been there long before I arrived and would be there long after I left. The question was whether I would have the courage to discover what it was, or whether I would become just another night shift supervisor who disappeared into the Texas desert without a trace. My second night at Blackstone oil rig began with Tommy pulling me aside before the day's shift departed. His nervous energy seemed more pronounced than the previous evening, his hands fidgeting with a wrench that he turned over and over in his palms. "There's something else you need to know about the rules," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Bill didn't tell you everything." He led me to a maintenance closet tucked away behind the main pump assembly and produced a laminated card from his pocket. The edges were worn and the print was faded, but the text was still legible. It was a list of protocols that definitely weren't in any employee handbook I'd ever seen. Rule 4. If equipment unit 7 starts humming between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., check the pressure gauges but do not enter the unit for any reason. Rule 5. The supply shed door must remain locked at all times. If you find it open, close it immediately and report the time to Elena. Rule 6. Never investigate sounds coming from the drilling platform storage area. Mark the occurrence in the log and continue with regular duties. I stare at the card, my mind racing. Tommy, what the hell is really going on here? These aren't safety protocols, these are survival instructions, he finished quietly. Look, I've been working nights here for 8 months. I've seen 3 supervisors come and go, and the ones who lasted longest were the ones who followed the rules without asking questions. The ones who got curious. He shrugged, but the gesture was anything but casual. Before I could press him further, Elena appeared in the doorway. "Day shift's leaving," she announced. "Time to begin rounds." That night, my duties included calibrating the pressure monitoring systems in equipment units 1 through 10. It was routine maintenance that should have taken about 2 hours, but as I worked my way through the units, I began to notice discrepancies that hadn't been apparent during my orientation. Equipment Unit 7, the one mentioned in Tommy's unofficial rules, was noticeably different from the others. While the other units hummed with the steady rhythm of well-maintained machinery, Unit 7 was silent during my inspection. The gauges read normal, the connections were secure, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the space. The air inside seemed thicker, almost viscous, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing why. As I completed my checklist for Unit 7 and prepared to move on, I noticed something that made me pause. There, on the concrete floor near the main assembly, was what appeared to be a child's toy. A small wooden horse, hand-carved and painted red. It was completely out of place in the industrial environment, and its presence raised immediate questions about how it had gotten there. I picked up the toy, turning it over in my hands. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of detail that suggested it had been made with care and love. But what was truly unsettling was its condition. Despite being in what should have been a dusty, oil-stained environment, the little horse was pristine, clean, unmarked, as if it had been placed there moments before I arrived. Find something interesting. Elena's voice from behind me nearly made me drop the toy. I hadn't heard her approach, and her sudden appearance in the doorway felt almost supernatural. Just this, I said, holding up the wooden horse. Any idea how a child's toy ended up in here? Elena's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to interpret. For just a moment, her usual stern composure cracked, revealing something that might have been sadness or fear. Put it back where you found it, she said firmly, and don't mention it to anyone else. But Elena, put it back, Jake. Her tone brooked no argument. I replaced the toy exactly where I'd found it and followed Elena out of the unit. As we walked back toward the main building, I couldn't resist asking, how many people used to work here? I mean, before it became a skeleton crew operation. Elena stopped walking. In the harsh illumination of the overhead lights, her face looked almost ghostly. Blackstone used to be a full operation. 3 shifts, probably 40 people total. Families sometimes visited on weekends. The company even built a small recreation area for the kids. She gestured toward a dark area beyond the main structures that I hadn't noticed before. That was 5 years ago. What happened? Budget cuts, the company said. Downsized to essential personnel only. But her tone suggested she didn't believe the official explanation any more than I did. As we continued our conversation, Tommy's voice crackled over the radio. Jake, Elena, you need to get back to the main console. We've got some unusual readings. When we arrived at the control room, Tommy was staring at a bank of monitors with an expression of barely controlled panic. Look at this, he said, pointing to a series of gauges that should have been showing steady pressure readings. Instead, the needles were fluctuating wildly, spiking and dropping in patterns that defied any mechanical explanation. Which system? I asked. That's just it, Tommy said. It's not any system we monitor. These readings are coming from Equipment Unit 12. I felt my blood turn cold. There is no Equipment Unit 12. We only have 10 units. Elena moved to another console and began pulling up facility schematics on a computer terminal. The blueprints that appeared on screen clearly showed only 10 equipment units, arranged in 2 rows of 5. But the readings Tommy was monitoring were definitely labeled as Unit 12, and they were coming from somewhere. This has happened before, Elena said quietly. Same time of night, same impossible readings. It lasts about 20 minutes, then stops. Where's it supposed to be? I asked, studying the schematics. Elena highlighted an area on the map that appeared to be empty space between Units 7 and 8. According to the readings, it should be right there. But as you can see, I knew what I had to do, even though every instinct screamed against it. I'm going to check it out. Jake, no. Tommy's voice was sharp with alarm. Remember the rules. Document it and move on. But I was already grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door. I'll be careful. Just radio me if the readings change. The walk to the equipment area felt longer than usual, as if the distance itself was shifting and expanding with each step. The night seemed darker too, the overhead lights casting pools of illumination that felt increasingly inadequate. As I approached the space between Units 7 and 8, my flashlight beam revealed something that shouldn't have been possible. There, occupying an area that had been empty concrete pad just hours earlier, stood another equipment unit. It was identical to the others in design, but somehow different in presence. The metal seemed older, more weathered, and there was a quality to its shadows that suggested depth and substance that defied the laws of physics. I approached slowly, my radio crackling with static that resolved into Tommy's voice. "Jake? Jake, the readings just spiked. What do you see out there?" There's actually a Unit 12, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's here, Tommy. It's really here." The equipment unit hummed with mechanical life, its gauges and displays functioning normally. But as I circled the structure, looking for some explanation for its sudden appearance, I noticed something that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. There were windows in this unit, small, rectangular openings about 4 feet off the ground that definitely weren't part of the standard design. And through those windows, I could see movement. Shapes that might have been people, flickering like shadows or reflections, but moving with purpose and intention. I approached one of the windows and peered inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The interior wasn't the industrial machinery I expected to see. Instead, it looked like a break room or recreation area, with tables and chairs and what appeared to be children's drawings taped to the walls. And sitting at one of the tables, so clearly that I couldn't dismiss it as imagination or optical illusion, was a little girl with dark hair, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She was playing with a wooden horse identical to the one I'd found earlier. As I watched, she looked up directly at me, made eye contact through the impossible window, and waved. I jerked backward, stumbling over my own feet and nearly falling. When I steadied myself and looked again, the window was just a window, showing nothing but darkness and a normal mechanical interior of an equipment unit. But the image of that little girl, that wave, that moment of direct acknowledgement, was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. My radio crackled to life. "Jake, the readings just dropped to 0. Whatever was happening, it stopped." I turned my flashlight back to where Unit 12 had been standing. Empty concrete pad. Nothing but the space between Units 7 and 8. Exactly as it should be according to the blueprints. But the ground where the Phantom unit had stood was warm to the touch, and I could still smell the faint odor of machinery oil and something else. Something like crayons and childhood and innocence. When I returned to the control room, Tommy and Elena were waiting with expressions that suggested they'd been through this before. "What did you see?" Elena asked. I wanted to tell them everything. The impossible building, the recreation room interior, the little girl with the wooden horse. But as I opened my mouth to describe the encounter, I found myself hesitating. Something about their carefully neutral expressions warned me that there were limits to what I should share, even with my fellow night shift workers. "The unit was there," I said finally, "for about 10 minutes. Then it was gone." Tommy nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Did you try to enter it?" "No." "Why?" "Good," Elena said. "The last supervisor who tried to go inside Unit 12. Well, let's just say he became very interested in the recreational area that used to be here. Started talking about children's voices and playground sounds. Company had to remove him from duty for psychological evaluation. The rest of the night passed without major incident, but every shadow seemed to hide potential revelations. Every sound carried the possibility of impossible discoveries. As dawn approached and the day's shift prepared to arrive, I found myself dreading the end of my work period. Not because I wanted to stay at Blackstone Oil Rig, but because leaving meant I would spend the entire day thinking about what I'd experienced, try to rationalize the impossible, and failing completely. During the shift change, I lingered near Equipment Unit 7, ostensibly checking my final readings, but actually looking for the wooden horse I'd discovered earlier. It was gone, of course, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. But the questions it raised remained, multiplying and growing more complex with each passing hour. As I drove home through the lightning Texas sky, I couldn't shake the image of that little girl waving at me through a window that shouldn't exist in a building that wasn't there. Somewhere in the history of Blackstone oil rig was a story that explained phantom equipment units and impossible toy horses and children who existed only in the spaces between reality and nightmare. I was beginning to realize that discovering that story might be the only way to survive my time at the rig, or it might be exactly what had happened to every other night shift supervisor who had started asking too many questions. Either way, I was already too deep to turn back now. On my 5th night at Blackstone oil rig, I had developed a routine that helped me maintain some semblance of sanity. Check the official equipment first, document anything unusual in the logbook, and try not to think too hard about the unofficial rules that seem to govern the facility's true operation. But on this particular evening, the desert itself seemed different, more alive, more aware of my presence. The sunset had been unusually violent, painting the sky in shades of red that lingered far longer than they should have before finally giving way to darkness. As I completed my initial perimeter check, I noticed that the wind patterns had changed. Instead of the usual steady breeze that whistled through the steel framework, there were pockets of absolute stillness alternating with sudden gusts that seemed to come from no particular direction. Tommy was agitated from the moment I arrived. His nervous energy had escalated to the point where he couldn't seem to stay in one place for more than a few minutes at a time. "Something's different tonight," he said as he showed me the pressure readings. "The gauges have been fluctuating all day, not just on the Phantom Unit 12. It's like the whole facility is unsettled." Elena, typically stoic, had also noticed the anomalies. "We've had 3 separate power fluctuations since yesterday evening," she reported. "Not enough to shut down any systems, but enough to cause brief disruptions in the monitoring equipment. The backup generators keep kicking, and even though the main power never actually fails." As if summoned by our conversation about electrical problems, the lights throughout the facility suddenly dimmed to about half their normal intensity, held that level for exactly 30 seconds, then returned to full brightness. In that brief period of reduced illumination, the shadows between the equipment units seemed to deepen and shift in ways that suggested movement where none should have been possible. "That's the 4th time today," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Always exactly 30 seconds. Always facility-wide. My first major task of the night was to perform routine maintenance on the communication array, a collection of radio equipment and satellite dishes that kept the rig connected to the outside world. The communications building was a small, windowless structure about 50 yards from the main facility, and I'd been putting off the assignment because something about the building made me deeply uncomfortable. As I approached the communications building with my toolkit and handheld radio, I noticed that the ground around the structure was disturbed in a way I hadn't seen before. The footprints I discovered on my first night had been mysterious but explainable. This was different. The earth around the building had been churned up as if by heavy machinery, but there were no tire tracks or equipment signatures that would indicate what had caused the disturbance. More unsettling still, the churned earth formed a perfect circle around the communications building, extending out about 10 feet from the walls in all directions. Inside the circle, the ground was pristine. Outside the circle, normal. But within that 10-foot ring, it looked like a battlefield. The door to the communications building was unlocked, which immediately struck me as odd since security protocols required all auxiliary structures to be locked when not in use. I keyed my radio to check in with Tommy and Elena before entering. "Communications building appears to be unlocked," I reported. "Should I investigate or wait for backup?" Elena's response was immediate and sharp. "Do not enter alone. Return to main facility." But as I turned to leave, I heard something that made me freeze in place. From inside the building came the distinct sound of a radio transmission. Voices speaking in what sounded like normal operational communication, but the words were muffled enough that I couldn't make out the specific content. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to understand what I was hearing. The transmission sounded like a conversation between multiple people, discussing routine rig operations, shift changes, and equipment status reports. But that was impossible. All radio traffic went through Elena's console in the main building, and she would have told me if we were receiving external communications. Against my better judgment and Elena's direct orders, I opened the door and stepped inside. The communications building was exactly as it should have been: banks of radio equipment, computer monitors, and the satellite uplink controls. But something was definitely wrong with the setup. Every single piece of equipment was operational, lights blinking and displays showing active status, despite the fact that most of this equipment was supposed to be powered down during night shift operations. The voices I'd heard from outside were coming from multiple radio speakers throughout the room, but as I moved closer to investigate, I realized that the conversations weren't quite right. They sounded like normal operational chatter, but the timing was off. Someone would ask a question, and the response would come before the question was finished. Multiple people would speak simultaneously without interrupting each other. And underneath it all was a quality that suggested the voices weren't quite human, close enough to pass casual inspection, but subtly wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. I approached the main communication console and discovered something that sent a chill straight through my core. The log screen was active, showing a record of radio traffic for the past several hours. But according to the timestamps, the communications had been taking place during daylight hours when the facility should have been fully staffed. More impossible still, the participants listed in the log included names I didn't recognize, and several entries from someone identified as Jake M., night supervisor. I hadn't made any radio transmissions. I was certain of that, but there on the screen were multiple entries attributed to me, discussing equipment status and responding to questions from people who apparently didn't exist. The most recent entry, timestamped just 5 minutes ago, showed me reporting that Unit 12 readings are stabilizing after evening anomaly. As I stare at the impossible log entries, the radio chatter around me began to change. The voices became more distinct, and I started to recognize some of them. Tommy's voice, discussing a pressure issue with someone called Rodriguez. Elena's voice, coordinating with a day supervisor Mitchell. And then, clear as day, my own voice discussing the communications building inspection with someone identified as base operations. I was listening to a conversation I wasn't having with people who didn't exist, being recorded in a log that documented events that weren't happening. The rational part of my mind searched desperately for some technical explanation, cross signals from another facility, some kind of equipment malfunction that was generating phantom transmissions. But the specificity of the content, the perfect match to our actual operations, made any technical explanation seem woefully inadequate. My radio crackled to life with Tommy's voice. "Jake, what's your status? You've been quiet for 15 minutes. I looked at my watch. I'd been in the communications building for less than 5 minutes, but somehow a quarter of an hour had passed. I'm in the communications building. There's something wrong with the equipment here. Get out of there now." Elena's voice cut in. "Lock the door and return to main facility immediately." As I prepared to leave, one of the phantom radio transmissions caught my attention with shocking directness. My own voice, coming from speakers throughout the room, was saying, "Base operations, this is Jake Morrison. I've discovered the communications anomaly. The equipment is receiving transmissions from previous operational periods. Recommend immediate investigation of temporal displacement theory." I hadn't said those words. I had never said those words. But there was my voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing theories I'd never even considered. And as the transmission continued, I heard base operations respond, "Understood, Jake. Continue investigation, but maintain safety protocols. Previous supervisors who investigated 2 deeply experienced psychological displacement. Document everything, but don't try to interact with the anomalous signals." When I finally made it back to the main building, Tommy and Elena were waiting with expressions of barely controlled anxiety. "How long were you in there?" Elena asked. 5 minutes, maybe less. But my radio log shows 15 minutes, and the communications equipment was receiving transmissions from. I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound completely insane. From operations that weren't happening. Tommy and Elena exchanged one of their meaningful glances. "It's getting worse," Tommy said quietly. "The anomalies are becoming more active, more direct." "What anomalies? What is this place really?" Elena moved to a filing cabinet I hadn't noticed before and withdrew a thick folder marked Incident Reports, Confidential. She placed it on the table between us and opened it to reveal dozens of handwritten reports, some dating back several years. "Blackstone oil rig sits on what the Geological Survey calls anomalous terrain," she began. "The official explanation is unusual mineral deposits that interfere with electronic equipment and create acoustic anomalies. The unofficial explanation is that this location exists in some kind of temporal overlap zone." I leafed through the incident reports, my amazement and horror growing with each page. Reports of equipment that appeared and disappeared. Radio transmissions from facility personnel who had never worked at the rig. Visual contacts with individuals who couldn't be identified. And running through all of it, references to children who had been present during the facility's earlier operational period, but who had somehow become trapped in whatever temporal anomaly affected the site. The recreational area Elena mentioned, Tommy said, it wasn't shut down due to budget cuts. There was an incident. Several families were visiting for a company picnic when something happened. The adults made it out, but the children. He gestured helplessly. "The children what?" "They didn't disappear exactly," Elena said carefully. "They became part of the facility's temporal ecosystem. Sometimes they interact with current operations. Sometimes they exist in their own time frame. But they're still here, still trying to continue their normal activities." As if summoned by our conversation, the facility's lights dimmed again to half power. But this time, during the 30 seconds of reduced illumination, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From outside, carried on the desert wind, came the sound of children laughing and playing. Playground sounds, voices calling to each other in games of tag and hide and seek. When the lights returned to full intensity, the sounds stopped abruptly. But in that brief window of dimmed lighting, I had glimpsed something through the main windows that defied explanation. Shapes moving between the equipment units. Small shapes, child-sized, running and playing in areas where no children could possibly exist. "They're trying to maintain their normal routine," Elena said quietly. "The picnic activities, the games, the exploration of the facility that children naturally engage in. But they're doing it in a time and space that's no longer connected to our reality in any normal way." "And the equipment units?" "Unit 12. The recreation area they built included temporary structures," Tommy explained. "Games rooms, snack areas, rest facilities for the children. Unit 12 appears to be a temporal echo of one of those structures, manifesting when the children's activities cross over into our time frame." The implications were staggering. I wasn't just working in an oil rig with unusual operating procedures. I was working in a location where time itself had become unstable, where past events continued to play out alongside present activities, and where children trapped in some kind of temporal loop were trying to continue their interrupted play. But the most terrifying realization was still to come. As I studied the incident reports more carefully, I noticed a pattern in the descriptions of the children's activities. They weren't just playing randomly. They were exploring, investigating, trying to understand the facility and the people who work there. And according to the reports, they had developed a particular interest in the night shift supervisors. Every previous supervisor had reported increasing interaction with the temporal echoes. First subtle signs, footprints, and moved objects. Then direct visual contact. Finally, communication attempts. And in every case, The supervisor had eventually become so focused on trying to help or understand the children that they had lost their connection to present-day reality. "They're trying to recruit help," Elena said, having noticed my growing understanding. "The children want someone to help them return to their proper time frame, or to join them in theirs. They're drawn to people who work alone during the quiet hours, people who have time to notice and investigate anomalies." As dawn approached and our shift neared its end, I realized that I was facing a choice that would determine not just my employment at Blackstone oil rig, but potentially my entire future. I could follow the path of my predecessors, becoming increasingly involved with the temporal anomalies until I lost my grip on present reality. Or I could find some way to maintain my sanity while working in a place where past and present existed side by side. But as I prepared to leave that morning, I heard one more transmission from the communications building radio system. My own voice, clear and unmistakable, saying, "Base operations, this is Jake Morrison. I understand the situation now. Beginning direct communication attempts with temporal echo subjects tomorrow night. These children need help, and I'm going to find a way to provide it." I had never made that transmission, but somehow I knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow night I would. The day between my 5th and 6th shifts at Blackstone oil rig was the longest of my life. I sat in my apartment, staring at the incident reports I'd somehow taken with me, trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. But every attempt at logical reasoning crumbled under the weight of what I'd seen and heard. The temporal transmission of my own voice, promising to make contact with the children, haunted me most of all. It suggested that my future actions were already part of the rig's anomalous timeline. That free will itself might be compromised in that place where past and present overlapped like photographs exposed on the same piece of film. I called in sick for my 6th shift, telling myself I needed time to think, to plan, to decide whether I was strong enough to continue working at a facility that seemed determined to pull me into its temporal maze. But as evening approached, I found myself driving toward Blackstone despite my rational mind screaming warnings. I wasn't scheduled to work, but something was drawing me back to the rig. The same something that had drawn my predecessors deeper and deeper into the anomaly until they lost their connection to the present day entirely. I told myself I was just going to observe from a distance to see what happened during a night shift when I wasn't part of the operational team. I parked about a half-mile from the facility in a depression in the desert floor that provided cover while still allowing visual contact with the rig. Through binoculars, I could see Tommy and Elena going through their routine, along with someone I didn't recognize, presumably my replacement, another night shift supervisor who would begin the same cycle of discovery and obsession that had claimed so many others. But as I watched, I realized that the facility looked different when viewed from outside its immediate influence. The equipment units that had seemed so solid and permanent when I was among them appeared to flicker and shift, as if they weren't entirely anchored to this reality. And between the structures, I could see shapes moving that definitely weren't part of the current operational team. Through my binoculars, the children were clearly visible, not glimpsed in peripheral vision or seen briefly in dimmed lighting, but present and active throughout the facility. They moved among the equipment with the casual familiarity of people who belonged there, playing games that incorporated the industrial structures into elaborate scenarios of exploration and adventure. There were at least a dozen of them, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12 years old, all dressed in clothing that looked like it came from several years earlier. They clustered around certain areas, particularly Equipment Unit 7 and the space where Unit 12 sometimes appeared, and seemed to be engaged in some kind of ongoing project or investigation. As I watched, one of the children, a boy of maybe 10 with sandy hair and a striped shirt, approached the main building where Tommy, Elena, and the new supervisor were working. He stood directly in front of the windows, waving and apparently trying to get their attention. But from inside the building, there was no reaction. The current operational team couldn't see him, or perhaps he existed in a time frame slightly offset from theirs. The boy's efforts to communicate became more animated. He pointed toward Equipment Unit 7, then toward the empty space where Unit 12 appeared, then back toward the main building. His gestures were clearly meant to convey information, to share something important with the adults who couldn't perceive him. When his attempts failed, he was joined by several other children, all of them trying different methods to bridge the temporal gap. It was heartbreaking to watch. These children, trapped in some echo of their interrupted visit to the facility, were desperately trying to communicate with people who existed in a slightly different time frame. They weren't malevolent entities trying to harm or mislead the living. They were kids who needed help and couldn't understand why the adults around them couldn't see or hear them. But as I continued my observation, I noticed something that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. Among the children playing around the equipment units was the little girl I'd seen through the impossible window of Unit 12. She was sitting on a piece of concrete barrier, playing with the wooden horse toy, apparently content to engage in solitary play while the other children focused their efforts on communication. And then she looked directly at me. Despite the distance between us, despite the darkness and the inadequacy of my binoculars, she made eye contact with perfect clarity. She raised her hand and waved, the same friendly gesture I'd seen through the Unit 12 window. But this time, she stood up and began walking in my direction. I lowered the binoculars and looked with naked eyes across the desert between my hiding spot and the facility. Nothing. Empty landscape. Undisturbed darkness. But when I raised the binoculars again, the little girl was closer, still walking steadily toward my position with a wooden horse clutched in her hand. I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the binoculars weren't just magnifying my vision. They were somehow allowing me to see across the temporal barrier that separated the children's time frame from the present day. And if I could see them clearly through the lenses, it was entirely possible that they could see me just as clearly. The little girl continued her approach, and I found myself frozen between fascination and terror. Part of me wanted to flee, to drive away as fast as possible and never return to Blackstone oil rig. But a larger part was mesmerized by the opportunity to finally communicate with one of the temporal echoes, to perhaps understand what had happened and what the children needed. When she was close enough that I could see her face clearly through the binoculars, she stopped walking and simply stood there, looking at me with an expression of patient expectation. She was maybe 7 years old, with dark hair and pigtails and a dress that looked like something from a family picnic. But her eyes held an intelligence and awareness that seemed far older than her apparent age. I lowered the binoculars again, hoping she would become visible to normal sight. She didn't, but when I raised them once more, she had moved closer still, now perhaps 100 yards away, and she was no longer alone. The boy in the striped shirt had joined her, along with 2 other children, a girl of about 12 with blonde hair and a younger boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They stood together in the desert, clearly visible through my binoculars, but invisible to normal sight, waiting for me to make some decision about what would happen next. I climbed out of my truck, keeping the binoculars pressed to my eyes, and began walking toward them. Each step felt like crossing some invisible boundary, moving deeper into the temporal anomaly that surrounded Blackstone oil rig. The children remained motionless, watching my approach with expressions that mixed hope and uncertainty. When I was close enough to hear them if they spoke, the little girl with the wooden horse finally broke the silence. "Are you the new night man?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air despite the fact that I could only see her through the binoculars. "Yes," I answered, feeling absurd but compelled to respond. "My name is Jake." "I'm Lucy," she said, holding up the wooden horse. "This is my daddy's horse. He carved it for me before we came to visit the oil place." The boy in the striped shirt stepped forward. "We've been trying to tell the night people about the problem, but they can't see us anymore. Are you different?" "What problem?" I asked. "The machine place is stuck," the older girl explained. "When the loud noise happened during our picnic, everything got mixed up. We're supposed to go home, but we can't find a way back to the right time." As they spoke, I began to understand the true nature of the temporal anomaly at Blackstone oil rig. During a company picnic several years earlier, something had happened. Some kind of industrial accident or equipment malfunction that had created temporal distortion. The adults had escaped the immediate effects, but the children, perhaps because they were more sensitive to the anomaly, or simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, had become trapped in a temporal loop. They weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were living children stuck in a recurring time frame, trying to complete activities that had been interrupted by the disaster. And they had been attempting to communicate with facility personnel ever since, hoping someone would help them find their way back to the proper timeline. "The machine that makes the loud humming," Lucy said, pointing toward equipment unit 7. "It broke when we were playing near it. Everything went funny after that. The grown-ups couldn't see us anymore, and we couldn't go home with our families." The youngest boy, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "We want to go home. We've been trying to go home for a long time." I felt a crushing weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. These children had been trapped in their temporal loop for years, becoming increasingly desperate for help as night shift supervisor after night shift supervisor either failed to perceive them or became so obsessed with the anomaly that they lost their connection to present-day reality. "I want to help you," I said, "but I need to understand exactly what happened and how the temporal distortion works." The older girl nodded eagerly. "We can show you, but you have to come to the machine place when the special building appears. That's when the time mixing is strongest, when someone from your time can maybe fix what went wrong." Unit 12. They were talking about equipment Unit 12, the phantom structure that appeared during the peak hours of temporal anomaly activity. And they were asking me to do exactly what every previous night shift supervisor had done: investigate the anomaly directly, despite the obvious dangers to my sanity and connection to present-day reality. But looking at their faces, seeing the hope and desperation in their expressions, I knew I couldn't abandon them to their temporal prison. Someone had to take the risk, had to try to understand the anomaly well enough to either help them escape or at least ease their suffering. "Tomorrow night," I promised, "when Unit 12 appears, I'll be there." The children smiled for the first time since I'd begun talking with them, and Lucy clutched her wooden horse tighter. "Thank you, Jake. We've been waiting so long for someone who could see us and wanted to help." As I walked back toward my truck, the children waved goodbye, their forms becoming less distinct as I moved away from the temporal boundary zone. When I reached my vehicle and turned back for one final look, they were gone, invisible even through the binoculars. But I knew they were still there, still waiting, still hoping that tomorrow night would finally bring the help they've been seeking for so many years. And despite every warning sign, despite the clear pattern of previous supervisors who had lost themselves in the temporal maze, I was committed to trying to save them. The drive home was filled with a mixture of determination and dread. I was going to attempt something that had destroyed the sanity of multiple people before me. But I was also the first person to establish clear communication with the trapped children, the first to understand the true nature of their situation. Tomorrow night, I would return a Blackstone oil rig for what might be the last time. I would enter Unit 12 when it appeared, attempt to understand the temporal anomaly from the inside, and try to find a way to free the children from their endless loop of interrupted play. Whether I would emerge from the experience with my sanity intact remained to be seen, but at least now I understood what I was fighting for. Not just my own survival, but the chance to reunite a group of children with the families they've been separated from by a quirk of time and space that had turned a company picnic into a temporal prison. My 7th night at Blackstone oil rig began with a sense of finality that pervaded every aspect of my preparation. I arrived earlier than usual, parking in the same spot I'd used for observation the previous evening, and spent the final minutes of daylight reviewing everything I'd learned about the temporal anomaly and the children trapped within it. Tommy and Elena were waiting for me when I entered the main building, their expressions suggesting they knew something significant was about to happen. The new supervisor I'd seen during my unauthorized observation was nowhere to be found. "Where's the replacement?" I asked. "Quit after one night," Elena said simply. So the place felt wrong, that he kept seeing things that shouldn't be there. Very perceptive for someone with no prior exposure to the anomaly. Tommy handed me the familiar clipboard with the night's assignments, but his hand was shaking more than usual. "Jake, whatever you're planning to do tonight, you need to understand that you might not come back from the same person. Every supervisor who's tried to solve the temporal problem has lost themselves in the process." "What exactly happened to them?" Elena pulled out a different file folder, this one marked with dates going back 5 years. "The first supervisor who encountered Unit 12 tried to document everything scientifically. He started bringing recording equipment, cameras, measurement devices. After 2 weeks, he stopped showing up for his shifts. Company found him 3 days later, sitting in his apartment, staring at a wall covered with temporal calculations and children's drawings. He was catatonic, completely unresponsive." She turned to the next report. "The second supervisor tried a more direct approach. He went into Unit 12 during one of its manifestation periods and stayed inside for the entire duration. When the unit disappeared, he disappeared with it. He reappeared 6 hours later, but he was different. Started talking about living in 2 time frames simultaneously, about experiencing the children's activities as if he was part of them. Had to be hospitalized for severe dissociation. The pattern was consistent across all the reports. Every night shift supervisor who had tried to directly interact with the temporal anomaly had suffered complete psychological breakdown, temporal displacement, or simply vanished entirely. And yet, here I was, preparing to attempt the same thing that had destroyed so many others. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're different," Tommy said. "You're the first supervisor who's established actual communication with the temporal echoes. The children trust you in a way they never trusted the others. Maybe that's enough to protect you from the worst effects of the anomaly." As the evening progressed, and the familiar signs of increased temporal activity began to manifest, power fluctuations, phantom radio transmissions, shadows moving in impossible ways, I found myself mentally preparing for what might be my final hours of normal existence. The children had asked me to meet them in Unit 12 during its peak manifestation period, which typically occurred between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. At 1:45 a.m., the readings for equipment Unit 12 began appearing on our monitoring systems. I gathered the equipment I thought might be useful: multiple flashlights, a portable radio, a digital camera, and a notebook for documenting whatever I discovered inside the Phantom unit. Tommy and Elena wished me luck with expressions that suggested they didn't expect to see me again. The walk to the equipment area felt like a funeral procession. Every step carried me further from the safety of documented reality and closer to a temporal anomaly that had claimed the sanity of everyone who had tried to understand it. But as I approached the space between Units 7 and 8, I could see Unit 12 materializing with increasing solidity, its impossible architecture becoming more defined with each passing moment. This time, I could see the children clearly without any visual aids. They stood around the Phantom equipment unit like a reception committee, their faces bright with anticipation and hope. Lucy ran forward as I approached, still carrying her wooden horse, and reached out as if to take my hand. Her touch was real, solid, warm, not the ephemeral contact I might have expected from temporal echo. "You came," she said, her voice filled with relief. "We weren't sure you would really come." The boy in the striped shirt, who had introduced himself as Danny during our desert conversation, gestured toward Unit 12. "The broken machine is inside. We can show you what happened, but you have to be careful. The time mixing gets very strong in there. As we approached the entrance to Unit 12, I could see that the interior was exactly as I'd glimpsed it through the impossible window. A recreation area with tables, chairs, and children's drawings on the walls. But now I could see additional details that revealed the true nature of the disaster that had created the temporal anomaly. One wall of the recreation room was dominated by a massive piece of equipment that looked like a cross between a generator and some kind of experimental device. It was obviously not part of the original facility design, and its presence in a children's play area suggested that it had been brought in as part of some kind of research project. The equipment was damaged, with exposed wiring and components that showed signs of catastrophic failure. The science people brought that machine to test something about the ground here, explained the older girl, whose name was Rebecca. They said it would help them understand why the equipment here sometimes acted funny. But when they turned it on during our picnic, it made a terrible noise and everything went wrong. Lucy approached the damaged equipment with the casual fearlessness of a child who had been living with it for years. "It's not dangerous anymore," she said, "but it's still mixing up the time. We can't get unstuck until someone fixes it or turns it off." I examined the equipment as closely as I dared, trying to understand its function and the nature of its failure. The technology was unlike anything I'd ever seen in standard oil rig operations. It appeared to be some kind of geological resonance device, designed to analyze subsurface conditions by generating specific frequency patterns. But the damage patterns suggested that it had encountered something in the ground that had caused feedback resonance, creating the temporal distortion that trapped the children. "How long have you been stuck here?" I asked. "We don't know exactly," Danny said. "Sometimes it feels like forever, sometimes like just a few days. Time doesn't work the same way for us anymore." As I documented the equipment and tried to understand the mechanics of the temporal anomaly, I began to realize that the children's situation was even more complex than I had initially understood. They weren't simply trapped in a repeating loop of their picnic activities. They were existing in a bubble of temporal instability that allowed them to experience past, present, and potential future events simultaneously. "We can see all the night people who work here," Rebecca explained. "Sometimes we see them at the same time, even though they came at different times. Sometimes we see you doing things you haven't done yet, or remember things that maybe won't happen." This revelation explained the phantom radio transmissions of my own voice discussing future activities. The temporal instability allowed information to flow backward and forward through time, creating a complex web of causality that defied normal understanding. But as I spent more time inside Unit 12, I began to experience the same temporal displacement effects that had destroyed my predecessors. I started seeing overlapping images of different time periods, the facility as it had been during full operation, the children's picnic in progress, previous night shift supervisors attempting their own investigations. The boundaries between past, present, and future began to blur in ways that made it increasingly difficult to maintain my grip on linear time. The children noticed my growing disorientation and surrounded me with expressions of concern. "It's happening to you too," Lucy said sadly. "The time mixing makes it hard to remember which one you belong to." But instead of panic, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Unlike my predecessors, I wasn't fighting the temporal displacement. I was accepting it, trying to work with it rather than against it. And in that acceptance, I began to understand something crucial about the nature of the anomaly. The damaged resonance equipment hadn't just created a temporal distortion. It had created a temporal anchor point, a location where multiple time frames could coexist and interact. The children weren't trapped in the past. They were trapped at the intersection of multiple temporal streams, unable to return to their original timeline because the anchor point kept pulling them back. "I think I understand," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "The machine created a temporal nexus. You're not stuck in your original time. You're stuck at a point where all times meet." To free you. I don't need to repair the machine. I need to break the anchor. The children looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. Will that send us home? Danny asked. I think so. But I need to overload the resonance equipment, because it'd completely fail rather than just malfunction. That might collapse the temporal nexus and allow you to return to your proper time frame. What I didn't tell them was that collapsing the temporal nexus might also trap me in the anomaly permanently, or scatter my consciousness across multiple time frames like my predecessors. But looking at their faces, seeing the years of hope and desperation they'd endured, I knew I had to try. I began working with the damaged equipment, using my knowledge of electrical systems to identify the components that were maintaining the temporal anchor. The process was complicated by the ongoing temporal displacement effects. I kept seeing multiple versions of myself performing the same actions at different times, and it became increasingly difficult to determine which actions I had actually completed and which existed only in temporal possibility. The children helped as much as they could, their knowledge of the equipment's behavior patterns providing crucial guidance. They had been living with the anomaly for years, observing its fluctuations and learning to predict its behavior. Together, we worked to identify the specific resonance frequency that was maintaining the temporal anchor point. As I prepared to initiate the overload sequence that would either free the children or destroy my sanity completely, Lucy approached me with her wooden horse. Thank you for trying to help us, she said. Even if it doesn't work, you're the first person who really saw us and wanted to help. I activated the overload sequence, sending massive electrical surges through the damaged resonance equipment. The temporal effects immediately intensified. I could see dozens of versions of myself performing the same action across multiple time frames. Could hear the voices of all my predecessors echoing through Unit 12. Could feel the boundaries between past and future dissolving entirely. And then, in a moment of perfect clarity that cut through all the temporal confusion, I saw the children walking away from Unit 12, moving toward a brilliant light that seemed to represent their original time frame. They turned back once to wave goodbye, their faces bright with joy and relief, before disappearing into the light and returning to the families they'd been separated from for so many years. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the ground outside equipment units 7 and 8. Unit 12 was gone, the space between the existing units showing no trace of the phantom structure. Tommy and Elena were kneeling beside me, their faces filled with concern and relief. How long was I unconscious? I asked. About 10 minutes, Tommy said. But Jake, something's different. The facility feels normal for the first time in years. The phantom readings have stopped. The radio anomalies have ceased. Even the power fluctuations have stabilized. I struggled to my feet, looking around the facility with eyes that saw no temporal echoes, no impossible shadows, no signs of the anomaly that had dominated the location for so long. The children were gone, truly gone, returned to their proper time frame, and reunited with their families. The temporal anchor had been successfully collapsed, but as dawn approached and I prepared to leave Blackstone oil rig for what I knew would be the final time, questions remained. What had originally caused the geological conditions that allowed the resonance equipment to create a temporal anomaly? Were there other locations where similar phenomena might occur? And most importantly, were there other children in other places trapped in similar temporal prisons and waiting for someone brave enough to help them? I quit my position that morning, but I didn't abandon my investigation of temporal anomalies. The experience at Blackstone had taught me that the boundaries between past, present, and future are far more fragile than most people realize. And somewhere out there, in other isolated locations where experimental technology intersects with unusual geological conditions, there might be other temporal anchor points creating their own impossible situations. Have you ever worked in a location that felt fundamentally wrong? Have you encountered phenomena that defied explanation, experienced time differently than you should have? or felt the presence of people who shouldn't have been there. The universe is far stranger than we typically acknowledge, and the barriers between different periods of time may be thinner than we dare to imagine. If you've experienced something similar, if you've encountered your own temporal anomalies or impossible coincidences, I want to hear about it. Because the children I helped at Blackstone oil rig may not have been the only ones trapped between time frames, waiting for someone willing to see them and brave enough to help. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you're paying attention and willing to accept possibilities that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality, those secrets reveal themselves to be cries for help echoing across time itself.